I've always been fascinated by maritime history, and I can't think of a better symbol of that than that of a lighthouse. And it's probably one of the more romantic and kind of old school things nowadays when we think about lighthouses, but they've been around for hundreds and hundreds of years in some form, and of course they're still in use today. And today I'm going to be visiting one of the most historic and oldest lighthouses in all of the West Coast. And as we approach the lighthouse from the parking lot, there are a few interpretive signs here that give some of the history, which is great. And here we see one that talks about Point Loma Lighthouse's existence from 1855 until 1891. It says here, San Diego's first lighthouse guided ships along the coast and marked the entrance to the harbor for over 30 years. A captain reported seeing the light from as far as 39 miles. For many years, it was the highest coastal light in the country, over 400 feet above sea level, so high that fog and low clouds often made it difficult to see. A new lighthouse was built at a lower elevation in 1891. And this is pretty neat. This looks like a metal depiction of San Diego Harbor. Here we see Coronado Island and North Island on that side where the Naval Air Station is. And over here is Point Loma. And to give you an idea of where we're at, we're all the way at the end of Point Loma, here where you would have the lighthouse. And they also have this metal depiction of Old Point Loma Lighthouse, as well as some of the outbuildings that were here, and some in some cases are still here. And as with any property that's on the National Register of Historic Places, particularly here in California, we see the California Historic Placard. This one, of course, to Old Point Loma Lighthouse. This last sign here talks about how the lighthouse was in service for 36 years, from 1855 to 1891, as mentioned. And it was, as many lighthouses were, a very lonely outpost. So lighthouse keepers, and if they were lucky to have their families here, lived a pretty lonely and secluded life. And I love these, I guess, cartoons, these depictions from the 1890s of just people coming up here and lounging and taking a horse-drawn carriage, or maybe an early car in the early 1900s up here just to take in the views. And even today, it is a pretty long drive. Most of that's due to traffic, but a pretty long drive to get out here. So I can only imagine how long and arduous of a journey it would have been by horse-drawn carriage, or even one of those older cars from the early 1900s to get up here. But as it was 130 years ago, the views today are spectacular. And before we actually walk up to the lighthouse and check that out, I just want to give you a quick view of San Diego Harbor down below and Coronado Island. And I promise you, this camera view really does not do it justice. This is just breathtaking. And I've been up here many times, and every single time, especially when it's a very clear day. Today's not too bad. It's fairly cloudy though in the distance, but it's still pretty clear. And being able to see the harbor and how it curls around Coronado Island and seeing downtown San Diego, the skyline there, center frame, it just always gets me. I absolutely love this view. And here we are approaching Old Point Loma Lighthouse. And it really is a nice day out. This is beautiful. Looks like there is a sign here. Oh man, look at that picture. The old horse and buggy out front. That would have been, looking at this angle, pretty much right here, in front of the lighthouse. That is neat. And this says, high and dry. Lighthouse locations were usually far from fresh water. To compensate, many lighthouses used rain catchment systems like the one before you. These giant concrete funnels diverted rainwater into underground cisterns where it was stored for later use by lighthouse keepers. Unfortunately, Point Loma's sparse rainfall, about 10 inches per year, didn't yield a high enough catch, and to survive, lighthouse keepers labored for hours hauling extra water by horse and wagon. They also limit each person's average water use to meager 1 gallon per day. And having lived in and near San Diego for many years, I can attest that they do not get a lot of rain. So I can imagine that this catch here to collect rainwater would not have been used too much. But it's kind of cool, built on the slope, and the water would have all drained down there. And yeah, wasn't used too much here apparently, but it is cool that they built this and that it's still here. Now, before we actually go into the lighthouse, I just want to give a little bit of the history on lighthouses here, at least in the United States. So obviously for most of human history, lighthouses and other navigational aids as such were critical for sailors that were sailing up and down coasts or looking for a particular harbor or an entrance, and generally just to avoid rocks and underwater hazards. And the first lighthouse that was established in the United States was the Boston Light in 1716. And today a circa 1783 lighthouse stands where the original Boston Light once stood on Little Brewster Island. Here on the West Coast, San Francisco had some of the earliest navigational aids, and mere weeks after California was admitted to the Union as the 31st state in 1850, Congress appropriated $90,000 to build lighthouses all along the California coast. The first lighthouse ever built on the West Coast was on Alcatraz Island, and it was illuminated on June 1st, 1854, although this lighthouse no longer stands. And the very next year, a lighthouse was constructed near the entrance of San Diego Harbor on this rocky peninsula known as Point Loma. And this was one of 6 original sites designated for a lighthouse to be built. Of course, that lighthouse we're talking about is the one that we're standing at right now, Old Point Loma Lighthouse. In April 1854, construction of this lighthouse began here on Point Loma, but it wasn't until August of 1855 when the crucial and expensive lens and lantern finally arrived by ship from Paris, France. The Point Loma lens was a third-order lens, which defines the size and approximate range of the light. For reference, there are 5 orders, with the 5th order being the smallest and 1st order being the largest, so this was a third-order lens, so right there in the middle. In October 1855, construction of the Old Point Loma Lighthouse was completed, and in the dwindling daylight on November 15, 1855, this lighthouse was illuminated for the first time. All right, now we're actually going to go into the lighthouse and see what we can see. All right, it looks like here on the first floor, they have, this space is the parlor. It says the Victorian parlor was traditionally a room used only to entertain visitors, but a lighthouse was not an average home, and that is definitely the truth. Here we see it furnished as it would have looked, I believe it said, in the 1870s, and a little bit bigger than I was expecting. But I do like all the maritime paintings there. Oh, this is kind of cool. I don't know if you can see this on here, but here on this wall there's actually a few Civil War portraits and paintings. This one right here says, "The gallant charge of the 54th Massachusetts Colored Regiment." And again, keep in mind that this lighthouse existed through the American Civil War, and if this is furnished as it would have looked in the 1870s, of course, the war would have already been fought and completed at that point. So it makes sense that you see pictures there on the wall dedicated to the American Civil War. And over here, the only other room on the first floor, it looks like, is the kitchen. Again, a much larger space than I was expecting, and it looks like there's actually a pantry and some storage back there. And sorry for all the reflection, all this is behind glass, you actually can't go in there, but it is neat to just see how it might have looked when, you know, a family would have lived here very isolated. Just imagine being all the way out here on this rocky outcropping of Point Loma. All you had was yourself and your family if they were here with you, so you had to make do. It's kind of cool. And up here on the second level of the lighthouse, you actually have a few rooms. This was the children's room. The keeper's children shared a bedroom, of course, with some interesting low ceilings, but not too bad. This here is the keeper's bedroom, and the accommodations aren't great, but honestly, not too bad. You had a little fireplace. Of course, you were stuck up here either alone or with your family if you were lucky. So, you know, I guess it could be worse, but not a ton of space. You got a lot of weird low ceilings, but this is cool. again, furnished as it would have looked in the mid to late 1800s. So yeah, life was already probably tough back then. I can't imagine being in a lighthouse. And now I'm going to go up to the third level, which is actually the light itself. But I will say I knew coming into this that to actually get up here, it's only open twice a year, on August 25th, the National Park Service birthday, and on November 15th, which is the anniversary of the first illumination of this lighthouse in 1855. But even with the cage here, you can actually get a very good view of this third order Fresnel light. Of course, San Diego is one of the biggest naval bases in the entire world here for the United States Navy. So it's pretty cool that from up here you can just look out over the entrance to the channel and see ships coming and going. And here we see one of the United States Navy's DDGs coming in. This is awesome. Next to the lighthouse is the assistant keeper's quarters. And today, this small building houses a museum, which is really, really cool. Teaches you all about how lighthouses work and also has some neat artifacts on display. And I think when most people think of a lighthouse, especially when you think about like lighthouses in the 1800s, you just think about maybe a fire burning or something somewhat simple. But in reality, when you look at these Fresnel lights and these Fresnel lenses that they had, it was a little more complicated than one would think. And you really did need a lighthouse keeper on site to maintain this and do the maintenance and ensure that this light never went out. And here we see a list of the different light sources for over the years. Of course, you had wood, coal, tallow, sperm whale oil, things like that, all the way to kerosene, of course, electricity, and then even solar today, which is neat just to think about how that would have progressed over time with technology. And there's the man himself, Augustin Jean Fresnel, a Frenchman from 1788 till 1827, a rather short life actually. And it says, an accomplished engineer and scientist, Fresnel changed our understanding of how light behaves and can be manipulated and intensified. And it is just fascinating to think about how these lenses actually worked. And here we see a small description on that. But, you know, really, I'm kind of not even spoiling you guys yet, because here in the center of the room is this remarkable third order Fresnel lens, which Point Loma Lighthouse was a third order lens. This one that we see here in the center of the room was the original third order lens that was used down at the lower Point Loma Lighthouse, or known as the new Point Loma Lighthouse. And this lens was used there from 1891 until 1997. But this would have been the same type and size of lens that you had in Old Point Loma Lighthouse. And this thing is just mesmerizing. Of course, they have a lot of other history here, talking about lighthouses along the West Coast. And Point Loma Lighthouse is one of 8 lighthouses built along the West Coast. It's kind of neat. It talks about all the different ones. Of course, we mentioned the one on Alcatraz Island, completed in July of 1853. One on Point Pinos, Farallon Island, Fort Point, Point Conception, Cape Disappointment. That's good. That's a good name. Old Point Loma Lighthouse, of course, completed in August of 1854, but not lighted for the first time until November 15th, 1855. And on Humboldt Bay. But there were quite a few. Obviously, today there are still a ton of lighthouses all along the West Coast. A lot of treacherous and rocky coastlines that sailors need to navigate. And even with today's technology, lighthouses still serve an important role. And we touched on it. Point Loma Lighthouse, although it was built in what they thought would have been an excellent location over 400 feet above sea level, because of the fog and low-lying clouds, this lighthouse was actually blocked many portions throughout the year. So they decided to build the new lighthouse in 1891 down at a lower elevation. So unfortunately, this lighthouse was only used for about 36 years, but the fact that it still stands today and is this awesome museum is really, really cool. Of course, what museum would be complete without a mannequin? It's kind of hard to see with the glass there, but this is a depiction of a lighthouse keeper. It's kind of cool. You don't really necessarily picture them in uniform, and I'm not really sure who they were wearing that for because they were basically up here alone with their families. But, you know, professional, all good. And of course, the lighthouse keeper and their families were really the people that made this all work. And Point Loma Lighthouse had 10 different keepers over the years. And it's just interesting to think about how lonely of a lifestyle that would have been, even with family here. But, you know, they made it work. They entertained themselves, and I'm sure it probably didn't go too crazy. Yeah, this is neat. Not a huge museum, but a ton of information in here and a ton of history. And I like this display. You get a lot of these older pictures of Point Loma Lighthouse. Here's Point Loma Lighthouse. It says it began to decay soon after its deactivation and abandonment on March 23rd, 1891. And this one's kind of cool. In 1913, under orders from the commanding officer of Fort Rosecrans, which was here on Point Loma, the Army established a radio station, the Lighthouse, and it served in that role throughout World War I. See these gentlemen on that front step of the lighthouse. This is really neat. Right next to the lighthouse and the assistant keeper's house is a small garden, much like you would have seen back in the 1800s. Again, this was a fairly, really, I guess, a really isolated lifestyle. So they would have needed to grow all the food, you know, vegetables, herbs, anything like that that they would have wanted right up here, because it would have been difficult to get supplies up here. Of course, because the rain catch wasn't very viable, they already had to bring water up here. So it's neat to see this little garden here, just as it would have looked in the 1800s. Now, of course, these lighthouses were useless unless you had a lighthouse keeper living here on station at all times to manage it, do the maintenance, and make sure that the light never went off. And for Point Loma Lighthouse, although it only existed for just over 35, nearly 36 years, it actually had 10 men serve as lighthouse keepers over those years. A man named Robert Decatur Israel served the longest. He began his time here at Old Point Loma Lighthouse on June 14, 1871, and he served until January 6, 1892. Now, Robert was a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and he previously worked as a blacksmith and saloon keeper. And during his time here at this lighthouse, his wife Maria served as the assistant keeper, and his 4 children lived here as well. And I can't even imagine for, you know, nearly 21 years living here with my wife and 4 kids. Again, from the 1870s to the 1890s, it would have been a very lonely lifestyle. And, you know, although there was some decent space and the views are fantastic, I'm sure this would get old pretty quick. So that's some serious dedication by Mr. Robert Decatur Israel. Though Point Loma Lighthouse was illuminated for the final time on March 23rd, 1891, thankfully it still stood over the years, although there was a time, I believe it was in around 1913, that they discussed tearing it down. So very thankful they saved the lighthouse and were able to keep it here as now a national monument for folks to visit. One other thing I thought was really cool that I learned was that during World War II, with the threat of an attack on the California coast, Point Loma Lighthouse was camouflaged and used by the military as a signal tower to guide ships into the channel. And then in the 1980s, the lighthouse was again restored, and of course today it serves as a historic landmark and museum so visitors can come and enjoy the beauty of it and the architecture, but also to come learn a little bit more about lighthouses and all that history. All right, well, that's it for Old Point Loma Lighthouse. I hope you enjoyed the visit. I definitely learned a lot about, again, our maritime history, but some specifics about lighthouses and Fresnel lenses and all these other interesting aspects to a lighthouse that I don't think many people think of. But it is cool that this still exists. Again, first illuminated 1855. You're looking at a 170-year-old lighthouse. It's just pretty fascinating, and it's cool to be able to walk through there, check out the museum, see some of the artifacts, and again, just learn more about U.S. history, maritime history, and some of California history. But that's going to be it for this one. Now it's on to the next journey.